Hi, I'm Judy Riley, and this is my brother, Jon Riley. He's been a missing person since April of 2013. So people are asking, like, why am I doing these videos? Number one is to find Jon. Number two is to set the record straight about what happened at Etobicoke Collegiate so that other students will come forward. It's been a 40-year journey of trying to seek justice for Jon and for all of the other victims at Etobicoke Collegiate. So this is part two of the video. The first part explained the assault, where it happened, and what happened with our family. So a quick recap. In 1980s, my brother and I went to a school in Toronto called Etobicoke Collegiate, and we were in the same grade, had the same peer group, and ninth grade, in our first year there, we both took music. Donald Strathdee was my brother's teacher, and Robert Judge, who's the assailant, was my teacher. Well, during that ninth grade, Robert Judge, who's the man who assaulted my brother, wasn't even my brother's teacher. He groomed him all of ninth grade and half of 10th grade before the assault. The assault happened halfway through the 10th grade in 1982. My brother was 15 years old. It was an event that changed my brother's life forever. And, he's a missing persons now, but Robert Judge essentially took our brother from our family that night because it became a lifelong quest to try and get Robert Judge incarcerated for the crimes he committed. And it's important to note that there are multiple victims. It's dozens and dozens of boys over decades. And my brother was the only outspoken victim out of all of those years. So essentially what happened is that when my parents found out, my father intervened, and he ended up, my dad was a professor at the University of Toronto. He knew how challenging it was to have a teacher fired. He knew that. He understood the workings of school. It was just going to be really, really hard for him to accomplish. He ended up, when he went to the principal, nothing happened. So he ended up meeting with the superintendent, who happened to be a friend of his. The superintendent is the sort of the boss of all of the schools in the area. So it was a behind closed doors meeting between my brother, the principal, the superintendent, and my dad. I don't think my brother was at that meeting, but my father spoke on his behalf. My father wanted Robert Judge incarcerated for what he did to my brother. And they negotiated a behind closed doors agreement that is not documented. And with a handshake, they agreed that Robert Judge, the pedophile, would leave Etobicoke Collegiate and never teach again. And my brother and I, halfway through the 11th grade, this is when this all went down, I believe it was 1984, my brother and I also had to leave the school. So you have to understand that when it happened, my brother didn't want people to know. He didn't want parents to know. He didn't want his friends to know. He didn't want students to know. He didn't want the community to know. He wanted his privacy protected. What should have happened, the police should have been called in. My brother should have gone through trauma therapy. Actually, all of us should have gone through trauma therapy, our entire family. And Robert Judge should have been investigated along with Donald Strathdee, who was also a music teacher, who was also sexually assaulting his students. And an in-depth investigation should have happened. But instead, everything got swept underneath the rug. And, my brother then just had to swallow the pain and swallow that trauma and pretend that it didn't happen. That grew and festered and ultimately led him, he ended up being incarcerated, my brother. Let me tell you the story. I wasn't going to share the story because I don't want my brother's legacy to be, this poster child about what happened at Etobicoke Collegiate. I also don't want his legacy to be what happened to him as a direct result of this series of events after the assault. If Robert Judge had been incarcerated for his crimes, I believe that an investigation would have happened if the authorities had been called in, if the police had been called in, and I believe that all of the other victims would have been uncovered. But what ended up happening is that everyone tried to protect my brother by not sharing with the community or the parents or other students. You know, there was whispers about it, but we wanted to protect Jon. In retrospect, what that did is it protected Robert Judge. To this day, the community, the parents, the school, the principal, the police, they are all protecting Robert Judge, the pedophile. Robert Judge's victims, I would imagine, between Strathdee and Judge, it's way over 50. I would guess it's over 100. I mean, they are serial sexual predators that worked in tandem at that school. After we were forced to leave the school, my brother and I went to different schools. We ended up not graduating. My brother, when he was in the 2nd grade, that was the first time I saw him fly, and he declared that he was going to be a pilot. After high school, he ended up going to flight school. And he wasn't just training to get his solo pilot's license. He was training hardcore to be a commercial pilot, and he was really good at it. He got his multi-engine, he got his instrumental license, he was working his way up the ranks, and then all he had to do at that point was accumulate flight hours. So he wanted to get a degree, so he went to a school up north, and that first year of university after flight school was catastrophic. It's really common for victims of sexual assault to go down a path of numbing the pain with drugs and alcohol. And that's what happened with Jon. He ended up in his first year of school at university. He actually almost OD'd, and accidentally. There was a bunch of them that almost accidentally OD'd. And right before the finals, my brother realized that the trauma that he had been carrying all of those years of that assault that was never talked about, that was just buried, he needed to stabilize. He was basically tail spinning. So he checked himself into a hospital to get to the bottom of everything that was happening to him. He essentially had a breakdown. When he was in the hospital, he found out that he would never be able to fly. His dream, his lifelong dream of being a pilot was no more. He would not be allowed to get a pilot's license because he had a breakdown. And that was the beginning of a journey that is very, very difficult to tell. I recently told the story to someone, and it was so hard to get the story out that I realized how traumatic it was. So essentially, my brother made a really poor decision. He decided that he was going to steal an airplane, and he was going to crash that plane into Robert Judge's house. So can you imagine the amount of trauma that my brother had swallowed and buried for all of those years? He had tried for years and years and years. He didn't want people to know. He didn't want the parents to know. He didn't want students to know. Didn't want his friends to know. But he did contact authorities nonstop. He was constantly trying to he wanted justice to happen, because what happened is just so unbelievable. While my brother was at flight school, and while we were struggling to get into school because we had been expelled from our high school because of this man, that man, Robert Judge, the pedophile, he went to law school and got a law degree. He became an expert in law, the pedophile. After he became an attorney, he ended up in the same classroom at the same school committing the same crimes against students. When my brother stole that plane, he was at a complete and total end of the rope that he didn't think Robert Judge, the pedophile, would ever pay for his crimes. And it was his last gasp effort to take Judge down. Midway through the flight, he decided that it wasn't the best course of action, and he buzzed the CN Tower. It was on the front page of the newspaper. He flew up north, and my brother ended up incarcerated. So now, if you think about that, my brother, who had been the victim of a crime, he had been sexually assaulted by this man who was now back in the same school, now has a law degree. He's untouchable. He has his reputation intact. Nobody's talked about the fact that Robert Judge is a serial sexual predator. He continues to assault boys. And my brother, who had tried so hard to set the record straight, now he was incarcerated. So my brother's life was tail spinning from what happened from the events of 1982. When my brother was incarcerated, a man tried to rape him, and my brother nearly killed that man. So now, the bad story gets worse, because now he's committed a crime inside of prison. We thought that the judge was going to, lock him up and throw away the key. And what ended up happening is my brother was sentenced to the Queen Street Mental Institution, which is downtown Toronto. It is a notoriously horrible hospital, and he was locked up. That was the same year that I was in Teachers College. I decided that I was going to become a teacher, and I would go down to visit Jon. I would actually prop the door open for him, and he would sneak out, and we'd go and play pool in downtown Toronto. And we had long talks about Robert Judge and how this man continued to carry on his crimes, continued to have this reputation that was, he had a stellar reputation, a pillar of the community. This man, Robert Judge, became an attorney, and he became an attorney for the parents at the school. So now, as I contact, my former friends and different students at the school, I say, hey, remember Robert Judge? I'm working on behalf of my brother to try and resolve blah, 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 blah. Oh yeah, Robert Judge. My mom did her will with him. Oh yeah, Robert Judge. Oh yeah, he did my parents' real estate when they sold their house. He did the deal. This man has enmeshed himself in the community and, highly regarded, and he's a serial sexual predator. It's important to note that at the time of my brother's disappearance, my brother had a checklist. He was on a mission of setting the record straight. Number one, get Judge out of the classroom at Etobicoke Collegiate. He was able to first accomplish that with the help of my dad in 1984. That man was never supposed to go back in a classroom. I don't know how he pulled it off. When my father accomplished that, he really believed that they were going to stick to that agreement and that Robert Judge would not ever teach again. His credentials should have been stripped. It should have been made absolutely impossible for him to teach. I believe right now that his teaching credentials, as well as his music credentials, should be stripped from him. They should rescind his diplomas and his degrees, because right now, he can still work as a private tutor. He still has access to young boys. Men like that, they don't change. When Judge ended up back in the classroom, my brother was intent on getting him out of the classroom. So It didn't work going to the police. It didn't work going to the Ontario School of Teachers. It didn't, or College of Teachers. It didn't work going to the Toronto School Board, who are in charge of all of the teachers and all of the schools in Toronto. It didn't work talking to the principal. Nothing worked. So in 2008, my brother found an attorney who actually believed in him, Simona Jelinek. Sadly, due to confidentiality agreements, if you ask Simona Jelinek if she represented my brother, her assistant Kevin will say, I can neither confirm nor deny that I was Jon Riley's attorney. I mean, the veil of secrecy on all of this is, it's maddening. It'll make you crazy investigating this story. It's one of the reasons why I am putting this out here. I don't want to shame my brother. He put up with enough shame. The reason that I share this story is so that other victims will understand what he went through, and perhaps they'll start to come forward. And we want Robert Judge's reputation. It needs to be on the record that this man is a serial sexual predator. Robert Judge was going to teach in perpetuity until my brother had an idea. He decided that in order to get Judge incarcerated and out of the school, he had to come forward and tell everyone in the community, his friends, his parents in the community, everyone. He was going to just spill the beans. He found himself an attorney. The attorney suggested that we hit Facebook, which was in its infancy. So in 2008, we plastered Facebook. We plastered that message that my brother was a sexual assault victim of Robert Judge. You can come forward, you can maintain your anonymity, and you can report to the police, this so-and-so officer, or you can contact Simona Jelinek. And Robert Judge, the pedophile teacher attorney, got himself a slander attorney, Peter Jacobson. Peter Jacobson sent my brother a letter that devastated my brother. He essentially says in the letter, if you go back to part 1, I read the letter, the attorney for Robert Judge says in the letter, my brother told this story in the early 1980s, the late 1980s, the early 90s, and here it was 2008. And they used my brother's mental health. The very reason for my brother's mental health decline was Robert Judge. And they used that against Jon. They kept saying that it didn't happen, the assault didn't happen, and that my brother was crazy. My brother, in exasperation, would show up at Robert Judge's residence, and he would threaten him, he would curse, and basically tantrum, because he was at his wit's end that this man was continuing to prey on students and children, and nothing was done. So in 2008, my brother received that letter through his attorney, from Robert Judge's attorney, and that he was going to have to pay for Robert Judge's court fees. That was probably one of my brother's lowest points, is that after he had put his face out there and told people that this happened to him, if he had to take those Facebook postings down, he was concerned that not enough victims had seen it, that maybe just a handful of people. So it was just, more shame heaped upon my brother. So there were 2 parts to the court case. Number 1, he pressed charges against Robert Judge, and there was a criminal court case, and that happened in 2009. All we needed was one victim to corroborate my brother's story, because up until that point, it had always been Jon Riley versus Robert Judge. We just needed one person. Thankfully, in the 11th hour, I believe there were 6 victims that came forward and said, this happened to me too. It was the identical story. These predator band teachers used Etobicoke Collegiate as their hunting ground. They set traps for young men. They groomed them And they normalized fraternizing with teachers. They normalized hanging out with at their houses. And then they used a ton of alcohol. They used drugs, and they were able to seduce these young men. Identical stories, victim after victim after victim. And the catastrophic thing that happened at that court case is that the statute of limitations had expired on my brother. Remember, he went to authorities in the 80s, the 90s, and now it was 2008. So judge couldn't be charged with sexual assault with my brother. They decided, they went into negotiations. In pre-trial, there was enough evidence that Robert Judge was definitely a sexual predator. So he agreed that by November 19th of that year, which happens to be my birthday, he agreed to surrender his teaching certificate and to never teach again. I think we've heard that before. But this time, it was before a court of law. It wasn't behind a closed door with the superintendent. This man was never going to teach again. They didn't rescind his diploma. They didn't rescind his credentials. He is still, has a couple of degrees from University of Toronto. I graduated from University of Toronto. My father graduated from University of Toronto and became a professor. My mom graduated 2 times from University of Toronto. And I have written the University of Toronto Music Department, and I've asked the Dean of Music to please consider rescinding Robert Judge's teaching degrees and his music degrees. They need to take away his diplomas, because those diplomas are what allowed him to prey on boys. So unfortunately, at that pre-trial, the win was that Robert Judge had to relinquish his certificate and never apply to teach in Ontario. That does not preclude him from being a teacher anywhere else on the planet, just not in the province of Ontario. So there was an inquiry from the Ontario College of Teachers, and because Robert Judge resigned before they conducted the inquiry, it doesn't say when you look up Robert Judge. I mentioned this in the previous video. It doesn't say that he's a sexual predator. It doesn't give the reason for why he resigned, but it does state that he resigned, and it says on there that he's never to teach again. It should say that he's a sexual predator. He should be listed he should be registered as a sex offender. So unfortunately, because Jon Riley versus Robert Judge, that court case only went to pre-trial. There's no record that it happened. They had a media ban so that the victims who came forward would be protected. But what happened is that by protecting those victims, you're protecting Robert Judge, because now his reputation is still unscathed. He's still practicing law. He's not practicing law, with a firm. He's practicing out of his own house, which is something a predator would do. He practices by soliciting the parents at the school who don't know that this man is a serial sexual predator. He also, if you Google Robert Judge Toronto, you'll see he rents out rooms in his house. There is no way that Robert Judge stopped preying on boys after my brother had him kicked out of the classroom. There's no way. Men like that don't stop. So the next thing my brother did is that he sued the Toronto School Board. The Toronto School Board should have intervened. It shouldn't have been up to my brother, Jon Riley. It shouldn't have been up to him to get this man out of the classroom. It shouldn't have been up to my dad. It shouldn't have been up to our family. Our family should have been protected. Our privacy should have been protected. We should have had counseling. We should not have been ejected from the school. And, that's one of the things on my brother's checklist. He wants honorary diplomas for John and myself. Both of us struggled after we left the school. We had to, we severed ties with our friends at Etobicoke Collegiate. There was, whispers that we were responsible for having this, hero of a man, Robert Judge, extracted from the school. People didn't want him to leave. He had groomed the parents, the community, the faculty. He groomed them all. So they were upset that he left. So you can imagine, you know, what a victory it was for my brother to make sure that Robert Judge was never able to teach at Etobicoke Collegiate again. It shouldn't have taken my brother 28 years. The next thing on his list, so number 1, get Judge out of the classroom. Number 2, get Judge incarcerated. You have to understand why that was important to my brother. My brother, the victim, was the one who ended up incarcerated. Robert Judge should be in jail for all of the victims, just even for my brother's assault, for all of the victims over decades. That man needs to be in prison. He needs to be serving time for what he did, and for all of the families that are affected by the trauma that happened to those boys. So my brother went to sue the Toronto School Board in, I believe it was 2012. My brother became a missing persons in 2013. I've been reluctant to share this story because I don't want my brother's legacy to be that as a victim. I want his legacy to be that of a hero. My brother worked so hard to have justice and to have Robert Judge removed from the classroom so he couldn't assault more students. My brother was on a mission. So let's go through the checklist. Sorry, it's really hard for me to tell this story, so I go all over the place. So number 1, get Judge out of the classroom, Robert Judge. Number 2, get Robert Judge incarcerated. Number 3, the teacher, Donald Strathdee, who was head of the music department, he worked in tandem with Robert Judge. So Donald Strathdee also had victims. He was also a serial sexual predator, which is how Robert Judge got away with what he got away with. And when he died in 1989 of AIDS, they ended up canonizing Donald Strathdee. At the school, it says Strathdee Auditorium. That auditorium at the heart of the school is dedicated to a serial sexual predator. It is because of Donald Strathdee that Robert Judge, who was not even my brother's teacher, had access to my brother. My brother was on a mission to get Donald Strathdee name off of that school. Number 4 on his checklist, he wanted a public apology. When my brother sued the Toronto School Board, he didn't win because they settled. And then there was a confidentiality agreement, and just like with the court, there was a media ban. So there's no record. His own attorney won't even say that she represented him. So Robert Judge has been protected. My brother got a pittance. He bought a bike and he went hiking on the El Camino in Spain. And he always joked and it rained. My brother should have, at the end of that settlement, there was a panel representing the Toronto School Board. They had the opportunity to tell my brother that what happened to him should not have happened. They had the opportunity to apologize to him. It was my brother, Jon Riley, who got that man out of the classroom. My brother is a hero. And somehow in the story, that gets lost. Instead, it's been portrayed that my brother is crazy. It's the deeper you go into the story, you would go crazy too. Why are these people protecting Robert Judge? So my brother wanted a public apology, not just for him, but for our entire family. I was forced to leave a school where I was an honor student. I wasn't even taking music in the 11th grade. Robert Judge made sure that in the 9th grade, I was out of the band. He doesn't want both of those men, Strathdee and Judge, worked on the sisters. But sisters have written to me over the years, about what happened to their brother and how their brother's lives tailspin. Some of them have even committed suicide, their brothers. And they wonder, like, what happened in the band? Maybe this is why that happened to their brother. But nowhere along the line has the school taken responsibility for protecting a serial sexual predators, 2 of them. Nowhere have they apologized or even had like a public announcement that this happened in our school and we need to make it right. Instead, they canonize one of the teachers at the school. When my brother became a missing persons, he was on a mission to accomplish those goals. I really believed that the police would investigate. So let's talk a little bit about my brother as a missing persons. I don't know if you've watched my other videos or followed the story. When my brother disappeared, the police would not take a missing persons report. I know that sounds impossible, but you know, things are changing now. I've worked really hard to continue advocating for change of police protocol of how they handle adult missing persons. And until the Bruce McArthur murders, they didn't take missing men seriously in Canada. At the time of my brother's disappearance, now you will understand why, even though my brother lived in Meaford, we were from Etobicoke, my brother had a history with 22 Division, Toronto Police. They knew him because my brother wouldn't shut up about Robert Judge. So part of the story that I have not shared with the investigation of my brother's disappearance is the story of this predator. Now, maybe you'll understand, you know, people say, why didn't you report him missing in Meaford? I started calling a 1-888 number, which was, it went to Barrie, which is part of the OPP, where he should have been reported. They didn't return my calls. So I had an old neighbor from that neighborhood go into 22 Division to report my brother's disappearance. She would go back every couple of weeks and she'd say, hey, can you enter Jonathan Riley into the computer? Is anything coming up? Because he's still missing. And they would say, oh, there's nothing in the computer. It didn't occur to us at that time that they weren't actually entering anything into the computer. Later on, they claim that we should have reported to the OPP. They should have held our hand and said, they should have called the OPP on our behalf. They should have followed through. They should have guided us through this process. My brother left a note that he was going to Toronto. We wanted him reported in Toronto because those police knew him. They knew his history. The other important thing to note is that when my brother committed that crime, when he stole that plane, they took his DNA. So I've mentioned over the years, you know, the DNA. Do you have the DNA? From 2013, when my brother disappeared, until the Bruce McArthur murders, so I get emotional about this, I believed that they had my brother's DNA, which they did, that it wasn't until 2018 when I kept asking them, are you checking these remains against my brother's DNA? That I found out weeks after my first questioning that the DNA they acquired after my brother committed that crime, they could not use that DNA to investigate whether he was a missing person. There's a law in Canada that you cannot use DNA collected from a crime to now compare the remains as a missing persons. So for that 5-year period, I believed that they had his DNA. I believed when, you know, I think it was about a year before the Bruce McArthur murders, a shoe with human remains washed up near Meaford, where my brother lived and had a sailboat. And I asked the OPP constable, who never returned my calls, Is that human remains? Can you check his DNA? Is that my brother? I just assumed they had his DNA. I just assumed all this time they were checking all the way along. I just thought there was this database. I thought that there was, unclaimed remains would be in a database and it would be matched with missing persons. That doesn't exist in Canada. So it wasn't until 2018 that I found out that they didn't have my brother's DNA. And that's when I started offering my DNA. Take my DNA. See if any of those victims belong to my brother. This story of my brother's disappearance, you have to understand that now we're in 2022. So now we're 40 years from when my brother was assaulted. My brother disappeared in 2013. My first formal investigation interview with the police in relation to my brother's disappearance was last January, a few months ago. It's now April. That was my first interview. And the first thing I said out the gate, have you investigated Robert Judge in relation to my brother's disappearance? Silence. In 2019 or 2018, out of complete exasperation, I decided that I was going to finish my brother's list. I never wanted to take over my brother's checklist. I didn't want to do that. I wanted my brother to feel empowered. I wanted him to fill the holes. I wanted him to seek justice. And I would always say, what can I do to support you? I'm here to support you. And, all the way through the trials, all the way through the lawsuits, what can I do to support you? So in 2018, it occurred to me during the Bruce McArthur investigation, as they were digging up bodies, that it occurred to me for the first time that it's very unlikely that I'll ever see Jon again. That was 5 years after he disappeared. When I found out that they didn't have his DNA, I just became completely hopeless. And I called Etobicoke Collegiate principal, and I just wanted to set the record straight. I wanted to have a conversation with her, and she wouldn't take my call. So I left her a hysterical letter or voicemail. It is the duty of the principal to understand the history of that school, and they can no longer deny it. They need to take Donald Strathdhee's name off of the auditorium. When I returned to Canada last summer, again, trying to turn the wheels of justice, trying to get some kind of investigation going on my brother, on his disappearance, trying to accomplish his checklist, I went to that old neighborhood. And when I see that school, it brings me to my knees. What happened in that school, the fact that I was expelled, that I cut off ties from all of my friends, for fear of telling the secret. And I went to the school, out of total exasperation, after trying to contact people in authority at the school to say, what are we going to do about this man's name that's on your auditorium? Nobody would hear my story. So out of total exasperation, I took some poster board and I wrote on it, Donald Strathdee and Robert Judge, band teachers at ECI, are serial sexual predators. And I walked up to the school, and it was like a total surrender. I was like, I know the story. You can continue to hide the story, but I know the story, and I'm not going to shut up about it. They made my brother shut up about it, but I'm not going to shut up about it. And I put that poster board on the front steps of the school. And in that moment, I was surrendered to no one's going to hear my story. The story, the way that it ended cannot be the end. My brother needs to be recognized for what he did for that school. And in that moment, I was sort of resigned to I'm really sorry, Jon. I've done everything I can. I can't find you, and I can't solve this this problem at the school. Look what it did to you. This is going to kill me. And I drove away, and then I went back 15 minutes later to take a photo of it, and someone had already taken it off of the front steps of the school. That's how fast. It was the middle of summer. The students weren't even in session. 15 minutes was all it took. I didn't tape it. I just placed it. It was gone. So the next day I went back and I put multiple signs all the way down all of the telephone poles. And I remember in that moment how happy my brother would be that someone now knows what happened at that school. I mean, totally toddler behavior. And when I got back home, I live in Hawaii now, an attorney called me and he said he would take on the case. And so I'm continuing to tell the story in hopes that victims will come forward. I know that these men have gone on to build their lives after this trauma. People don't want to revisit what this man did. I wrote an email to the principal about getting Strathdhee's name off of the auditorium so that she would understand the history. It was just a short note. It was not hysterical. And in response to my email, she wrote to me, "Good evening, Ms. Riley. We take all allegations seriously and prioritize the safety of all children in our care. We have taken some time to look into your allegations. However, at this time, there is not sufficient information to proceed with the formal investigation." This is the principal of the school who never talked to me. And, to say that it doesn't merit an investigation without even talking to me. So I responded to her email and I said, "Well, thank you for your complete and total denial that any of this has happened. And I guess you'll just have to watch the documentary." And so a few weeks later, I got a contact from an investigator at the Toronto School Board. And he called me up and he said, or actually emailed me, "Would you like to talk on the phone? Tell me your story." I was like, oh my gosh, tell me the story. Here we go. 40 years after it happened, let me tell you the story. So he arranged to meet, and within the first few minutes of the phone call, as I'm telling my story, he says, "Oh, I'm sorry. Didn't you read the minutes from the lawsuit that your brother had against the Toronto School Board? The one that he won? Oh, there's a confidentiality clause. We can't talk about Robert Judge." So 40 years after the incident, after working with my brother for 28 years to get Robert Judge out of the classroom, and then now my brother's a missing persons and working in earnest to try and finish his checklist on his behalf, I am not allowed to talk about Robert Judge. Again, protecting the serial sexual predator. It even went so far as, there's a story that's about to be released about my brother's disappearance. That's the one where I was pretty hysterical as I told the story, because it was the first time I actually talked about the story to someone. They called my brother's attorney, and the assistant said, "We can neither confirm nor deny that we represented Jon Riley." Someone has to go in my brother's court, and it can't just be me. And the problem is you reach a point of total and complete exasperation of the absurdity that my brother was assaulted by a teacher where we are mandated by law to go to that school. We don't have a choice. We have to go there. And that's what they provided for us, a serial sexual predator, a pair of them. And that the community and the parents and the other students continue to protect Robert Judge and use him as an attorney, it's an absurd story. So the reason I'm sharing this video is in hopes that other students will come forward. The good news is that in 2016, they changed the statute of limitations. Statute of limitations doesn't exist anymore. if you're a victim of Robert Judge or Donald Strathdee, you can come forward. You can do it anonymously. You can either email me. I'm going to post the information for the attorney. He's known as the priest hunter. He was responsible for taking down priests who were sexual predators in Canada. He doesn't believe in settling. He takes these people to trial at great expense because he understands the power of the victim being able to tell their stories. And what happens when you go to trial is that it's all documented. And all of this nonsense of not being able to tell the story because of confidentiality agreements, it doesn't happen when you go to trial. So please share the story. Please help our family. Please help the other victims. If you were in the band, if you know any students at the school, if you know parents that are familiar with the level of fraternization, they can help. They can participate. They can change history and they can set the record straight, because I am the last voice right now. I am the last voice. I'm 54 years old. And when I die, there's going to be Donald Strathdee's name on that auditorium, and the students who go to that school are not going to know the history of that, of what those men did to those students in that school. Please share our story. Thank you for listening.